Okay, I think we're going to get started. If I said yesterday that you're in for a ride, today you're in for a real ride. There's a lot to keep track of, and so therefore I'm going to try and go a little bit slower so that everybody can follow what we're saying, because there's going to be different discussions about the distance that the Tumah can travel, whether it can be Rishon, Sheni, Shlishi, Revi, differences between whether it can go from Sheni to Shlishi, what is a Sheni, what is a Shlishi, and Kal V'chaimas. It's exciting. There's a lot of exciting things going on today. So I want to go a little bit back. I want to go to Daf Chav Gimel Amud Beis, where we're going to discuss the seventh case listed in the Mishnah, which talks about the vessel, the keli, which combines everything that's in it for Kodesh, but not so for Truma. And the discussion we're going to have is whether this has biblical origins, or is this a rabbinic, is this something that is rabbinic? Okay, so this is Daf Chav Gimel Amud Beis. In the art scroll is 23b2, and it's like 2/3 of the way down the page. Hako mitzarif masha b'teicha l'kedesh avaloi l'truma. Everybody have it? Okay, let's do it. Frank, the Gemara asks as follows: you're telling me that one of the extra stringencies is that a vessel can combine all the things that are inside, even if they're not touching each other. They can combine as one to become, to contract tumah. So that means if one person who is tamei touches even something that is at the side of this vessel, meaning the beginning of the vessel, inside the vessel, anything else that's inside that vessel, even if it's not touching it, is combined into one, and that they too would become tamei. So the question is, how do we know this? So Reb Chanan says, because it says in the Torah, this is with regards to the karbonis, the ketores that were offered up in Parshas Nasai. It says over there, kaf achas, 1 spoon, asara zov, Malaya Ketariv. It was a 1 gold ladle of 10 shekel filled with incense. Now, what is it? What is the point of saying the word achas? You could have just said kaf asara zov Malaya Ketariv. The fact that it says achas, so therefore the Gemara learns with this. Hakosuf asoyin l'chol basher kaf achas. The Torah makes that's in that 1 ladle into one entity. Okay, no problem. But what comes out from this then is that according to Rebbe Chanan, this that the rabbis say that by Kodesh there's an extra stringency, and that extra stringency is that everything is combined into one, is of biblical origins, right? Because we're quoting from a pasuk, and so we're saying we learn it out from a pasuk that would make it a biblical source. So now Moshe Rav Kana challenges this. He challenges Rav Chanan basically to say, how can you say that what you are applying to Kodesh is a Deiraisa? It seems that it's really the Rabbanon. Where do we see this? Because he quotes from a Mishnah, so in the Mishnayos of Adius, different people testify to different things that they've either witnessed or they learned with regards to things that took place in the Beis Hamikdash, or other laws that they were trying to figure out. So what somebody had mentioned a particular law, and Rabbi Akiva came along and added to that and said that the soiles, which is the fire and the flour, and the ketores, which are the incense, va'alavina and the frankincense, va'gecholim and the coals, right? They are subjected to the same rule that came before him. That what? She'im nogat full yain, the mitzasai, if a full yain touched the edge of the puzzle is kulay. He makes all of it puzzle. Again, let me remind you, what is a tful yoim? A tful yoim is someone who is at least a shady betuma, right? Is tamei, and he goes to the mikvah, and although the mikvah renders him pure, he's not completely pure, and so therefore he cannot touch kodesh until at least he has har of shemesh. And in some cases he needs to have the carbon that he brings in the morning. But be that as it may, when it comes to a tful yom, if he before waiting for the evening touches something part of kodesh, then it puzzles all of it. He makes all of it unfit. Now let me correct myself. This is not talking about kodesh. This is actually talking about he's actually talking about the para aduma, as we'll see. And this statement of Rabbi Akiva concerning the flour and the incense, etc., right? This is certainly only on a rabbanon level. Mimai, how do we know that it's all on a rabbanon level? Mediktoni Resha, because the beginning of this Mishnah in Adius said, "Hey, Reb Shimon ben Beseira testified al berchatos shenoga hatoma b'mitzosai regarding the chatas ashes, that if a tamei touched part of it, shetimeis kulam, then he made all of it tamei." So Reb Shimon ben Beseira is telling us that all of the chatas ashes within one vessel are going to be considered one, and that certainly can only be a rabbinic decree. V'katani ha'isiv Rebbe Akiva, and the Mishnah then states that Rebbe Akiva added that fine flour, incense, and so on are also going to be considered to be what? Are going to be considered as if they are one, so long as they're in the same vessel. But obviously this must be a Rabbanan. So let me explain what's going on. Okay, for those who just joined, we're holding 23b2 in the article, the bottom of the page, Amar Reish Lakish. So before we get to that, let me just explain what's going on. We're trying to understand the law of the Mishnah. The law of the Mishnah is that when a person comes along and he touches a piece of meat that's inside of a pot, or anything else that is inside of a pot, everything else in that pot becomes tamei when it comes to kodesh. And the reason is because the rabbis made this extra stringency, or there is an extra stringency. We're going to see there's a machlekes whether it's the Raisa or the Rabbanan, but there is an extra stringency that all of them are considered combined and as if they're all touching. They're all connected. Okay, fine. The question is, what's the source of it? So Reb Chanan wanted to come along and say the source of it is a pasuk, and the pasuk says that regards to ketores, kaf achas asara zahav blei ketores, right? One spoon, one gold ladle, right, which is of 10 shekel filled with incense. So since it says that extra word achas, it teaches us that all the contents in that ladle are all going to be considered one, so that if anybody touches any part of it, then if a part of it becomes tamei, the whole thing becomes tamei. Now, what's important to understand is everything that are mentioned in that pasuk is referring to the incense that are brought upon the mizbeach. If it's something that is brought upon the mizbeach, you have what's called the kedushas hamizbeach, right? It has the sanctity of the mizbeach. It has this. It's considered to be kodesh, and so therefore, seemingly, anything that pasuk teaches should only be with regards to things that are on the mizbeach. Now, the fact that Reb Shimon ben Beseira comes along and tells us that this is not only with regards to the ketores, but it's also being applied to the ashes of the parah adumah. And the ashes of the parah adumah, we know, were not brought on the mizbeach. Okay, it was outside of the Beis Hamikdash, so therefore it could not be the Oraisa. It could only be the Rabbanan. And the fact that Rabbi Akiva goes on to say that all the things that are in a vessel, like for example the soiles, the ketores, and the levina, and the gecholim, right? all of these things too, even though the Silas and the Ketores and the Levoina and the Gecholim are really things that are not brought outside of the Beis Hamikdash. They're brought inside of the Beis Hamikdash, right? And yet Rabbi Akiva is coming along and saying that they are considered to be combined as one, which, if not for the fact that he was teaching this after the teaching of Rabbi Shimon ben Beseira, I might say that Rabbi Chanan had a point, that perhaps that you could learn from the pasuk Kaf Achas, Asor Zav Malay Ketores. From this Kaf Achas, you could also learn with regards to anything, right, that was combined in a vessel can be considered to be all as one with regards to Kodesh, but because Rabbi Akiva is teaching this as a continuation to Rabbi Shimon ben Beseira, so therefore I have to assume that Rabbi Akiva's teaching is just like Rabbi Shimon ben Beseira's teaching, meaning just like Rabbi Shimon ben Beseira is teaching something d'Rabbanan, so too with regards to this flour and this and the coals and the frankincense, etc. Even though they're kodesh, nevertheless, the fact that they combine together is only midrabanan, not the eraisa, which serves as a problem and a challenge to Reb Chanan. Does that make sense? Anybody? Is anybody following?
We're trying to.
We're trying to. So I'll one more time. Let's try this one more time. Everything is precise. That is the assumption. The fact that one thing is stated as continuing off from the previous thing, it says Hoisiv Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva added to what Rabbi Shimon ben Beseira says. It means, we're assuming what it means is that just as Rabbi Shimon ben Beseira was teaching a rabbinic law, so too Rabbi Akiva was teaching a rabbinic law. If Rabbi Akiva was teaching a rabbinic law, then how can Rabbi Chanan come along here and say that it's actually a biblical law? It's a d'oraisa that they all combine together. Okay, that's the challenge of the Gemara. Does that make sense?
So, Rabbi, it's not derisa; it's Rabbanan based on Rabbi Akiva. You're saying
that's what the Gemara is trying to challenge Reb Chanan with. He's trying to challenge him and say, "You're saying it's a deraisa because you have a pasuk, and I'm saying that it cannot be a deraisa because you have a Tana, Rabbi Akiva, who is teaching us that it's a derabanan by saying." By the Mishnah telling us, Rabbi Akiva, he was continuing on and adding to what Rabbi Shimon ben Beseira said. Rabbi Shimon ben Beseira's law must be a derabanan, right? So therefore, whatever comes after that, what Rabbi Akiva adds must also be derabanan. That is the challenge that we have to Reb Chanan's teaching.
I see. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
So Amaresh Lakish Mishum Kapara. Rish Lakish says in the name of Bar Kapara that the answer is as follows. And here we go over to Daf Chav Daled Amud Aleph 24a. He says Rebbe Akiva's din is a very unique din, which once you understand it, you'll understand why it's rabbinic. And therefore, when you understand this clearly, you'll find that it's not really a challenge to Reb Chanan. Why? Because he explains, the law that Rebbe Akiva came to teach us was only needed for the remainders of the flour of the mincha offering. The mincha offering, the way they would do it is you'd have a container, right, a vessel that would have the flour, but from that flour, the kohen would stick his hand in, and he would do kmitza, which means he would rub off the top, rub off the bottom, and whatever's left in the hand, he would take that, and that's what was offered up. Now, what do you do with the rest of the flour? The rest of the flour is eaten by the kohanim. Okay? Now, since this is no longer going to be going on to the mizbeach, right? So Rabbi Akiva wanted to say a special new idea, a new law, so to speak, that these remainders of the mincha, they also combine. That if anybody touches a part of it, right, you can't just say, well, we'll remove that part and the rest will remain tahor. We say that the vessel combines all of the flour that's still all of the flour together, so that all of it will become tameh, not on a biblical level, on a rabbinic level. Why? Because the svara, the idea is like this: the oraisa on a biblical level, sarich lakli hakli b'tzarfai. If the vessel is needed, right, then the vessel will combine everything. In other words, in order to bring something up, it had to be brought in a klishares, and since it's being brought in this klishares is needed. So since it's needed to be contained all together in this vessel, therefore the klishares will combine it all together. However, once you're at a point where a vessel is no longer needed, on a biblical level, anything that doesn't require a vessel, the vessel does not combine it. So therefore, when you have the shiori amincha, the remainders of the flour that was brought up, so the remainder that was going to go out to the kohen to consume, to eat, right? Now, that doesn't need a vessel. And since it doesn't need a vessel, the fact that it technically isn't a vessel doesn't make any difference in terms of combining it together on a biblical level. Aim along Rebbe Akiva to tell us that these things that were left over, they still combine as one. That's what Rebbe Akiva was teaching us. That the rabbis came along and decreed that even though on a biblical level, they don't combine. The afagav, the enitzarch lekli, even though these remainders don't require a vessel, nevertheless, the vessel combines it into one, and therefore what? And therefore, even Rebbe Akiva could agree to Rebbe Chanan. Why? Because Rebbe Akiva wasn't saying that the idea of kodesh combining together is not the eraisa. He's saying that the remainders of the flour that were not going to be used, right, on the mizbeach anymore, but were going to be given to the kohanim, those are the things that midrabbanan are still combined as one. And so therefore, he could still learn it out from the pasuk of Kaf Achas. Okay, sorry, 1 second. Somebody's trying to get in. Okay, so that is how we try to resolve it to begin with. Now, the Gemara asks, Tinach Stoilas. Okay, this answer works with regards to the flour. That what? That with regards to the remainder of the flour, we're going to say that it can combine, right? They can all combine together and become tamei. However, the question is, what about ketores, olavoina, ma'ikalamema? What are we going to say with regards to the incense and the frankincense, right? Which do need a vessel. In other words, it's very nice to give me an answer to say that Rabbi Akiva, right, when he was saying about the flour, he wasn't talking about the flour that's going. He wasn't talking about the flour that's going on the mizbeach, right? He was talking about the shi'arei the leftover of the flour. But what about the coals? And what about the frankincense? And what about these other things, right? These things do go on the mizbeach, and so therefore we're still left with a problem with what Reb Chanan is saying, because these things do go on the mizbeach, and nevertheless Reb Akiva is continuing on from Reb Shimon ben Beseira, and that implies that what he's saying is only on a rabbinic level. So the Gemara comes up with a very interesting answer. It comes along and he says like this. You want to know what the Mishnah is talking about? Omar Reb Nachman. Omar Rabba Ba'avu. Reb Nachman says in the name of Rabba Ba'avu. Going, for example, Shetzovran al gabe kartavlo. Rabbi Akiva is talking about where, for example, you piled them, the incense and the frankincense, onto a leather spread, which is basically you took some leather and you cooked it, and somehow that became hard. Now, the thing about a leather spread is that it is flat. And the principle is like this. If you're going to learn something out, let's say from kaf achas, right? So everything you want to derive from this law about kaf achas has to be similar to the kaf achas. What do we know about the kaf achas? That it has an interior, right? It has an interior. It's not flat. So therefore, the Oraisa on a biblical level, yes, if it has a interior, meaning it has like a groove, an interior, then mitzaref, then kodesh contents are all combined into one entity. But ein lo toich, if it doesn't have an interior, then ein a mitzaref, it doesn't combine into one entity. And here's where the Rabbi Akiva comes along and tells us, but also Rabbanon v'tiknu, the rabbis came along and made a decree, the al-fagav, the ein lo toich, even though it doesn't have an interior mitzaref. And so therefore what? Therefore, everything that Rabbi Akiva presented in the Mishnah that you're quoting were things that were decreed by the Rabbanon. Why? Because so long as the things that you're combining are not being combined into a vessel that has an interior, then on the D'oraisa level, they're not going to combine as one. So Rabbi Akiva came along to tell us that even in such a case, when it's flat, the rabbis made a special decree when it comes to Kodesh that they're all going to combine as one. Now that we've resolved all of these questions on Reb Chanin, it seems like Reb Chanin has got a free pass to go. That on a biblical level, we learn out from Kaf Achas, Asar Zav, B'lei Ketores, we learn out from this Ketores that anything that is put into a vessel, right? The vessel combines all the contents when it comes to Kodesh. However, says the Gemara, Reb Chanin is not the only guy. Opligi the Reb Chanin ad Rabbi Chia bar Abba. There's another opinion, and that's the opinion of Reb Chia bar Abba, who holds differently. The Omer Reb Chia bar Abba, Omer Reb Yechnan, Reb Chia bar Abba says in the name of Reb Yechnan, Me'edusay shel Rabbi Akiva nishnes Mishnah zu. Our Mishnah, when we come along and we teach that one of the milas, one of the extra stringencies of Kodesh over Truma is that you don't combine that you combine everything together. Where does our Mishnah get this idea from? It gets it from the testimony of Rabbi Akiva. And everything Rabbi Akiva taught in that Mishnah is what? Is the Rabbanan. And therefore, he disagrees with Rabbi Chanin, and he says that no, it's not the Eraisa. We do not learn it out from Kaf Achas Asaras or B'lei Ketores. That's not where we learn out that you combine everything together. We learn it from the Mishnah, the testimony of Rabbi Akiva, who taught us that the Rabbanan were the one who came along and made an extra stringency when it came to Kodesh to combine all the contents together. And that fits well, Rabbi Chia bar Abba's view fits well with our general view of our Mishnah, because it seems from our Mishnah, right? It seems from our Mishnah that when we talk about the 11 or 10 different stringencies that exist with Kodesh over Truma, it seems clear that all of them are rabbinically enacted. They're all rabbinical stringencies and not biblical ones. If we were to follow the opinion of Rav Chanin, then at least this one would be a extra stringency that is not the Rabbanan, but rather it's the Eraisa stringency. Okay, now something I wanted to share with you, and that is the Rambam. The Rambam, this is in chapter 12 of Shara Versatuma. He comes along and he paskins according to Reb Chia Bar Abba, not according to Reb Chanim. But what's interesting is he still uses the pasuk Kaf Achas not as a biblical source, but as an asmachta, as a remez. So let's just read Halacha 7. He says like this: everything inside of a container is considered as joint with regard to kodesh, consecrated food, but not with regard to truma. What is implied? He said, when there is a container, 1 second, someone's trying to get in. When there is a container filled with fruits that are separate from each other, for example, raisins and dried figs, if a source of impurity touches one of them, everything that is in the container is impure with regards to kodesh, consecrated food, but not with regards to truma. All of these stringencies, says the Rambam, are rabbinic in origin. There is, however, an allusion to this stringency in the Torah, right, where it says 1 golden ladle weighing 10 shkalim filled with incense. The Chachamim said that everything that is in the ladle is considered as one entity. Even if a kli does not have a hollow space, everything that upon it is considered as joined together with regard to consecrated food. For example, figs that were collected on a board or on a hide, that's the leather thing that we were talking about, even though they are not touching each other, and even though they're not hollow, nevertheless, they are considered as a single entity. So we see that the Rambam paskins according to Reb Chia Ba'aba, but yet he still holds on to the pasuk Achas, and he uses that as an asmachta, as a remez, at least, to the stringency enacted by the Chachamim, but it's not a biblical stringency. So that's what I wanted to share with regards to that. Okay, everybody still with me today? We're now going to move on to the 8th case in the Mishnah. Okay, so the
Rabbi, I just want to ask you some backtrack a little bit about flour. Flour does not have to be held in a kli when that's given to the Kohanim?
In other words, there's no biblical requirement anymore for it to remain in the vessel. You can empty it out. It doesn't have to be in this kli sharis anymore. Okay, it's only when you bring it and the kohen is going to take a kmitza from it that it needs to be in a vessel. But once that is done, it no longer needs to remain in a vessel. The fact that it technically is in the vessel because no one's emptied it out isn't something that is required. And because it's not required, we're saying on a biblical level, if the vessel is not needed, then it doesn't combine the contents. It's only the rabbis came along and made a special stringency to say that when it comes to kodesh, even if the vessel is not needed, nevertheless, the vessel will combine all of the contents to be one, considered as one, and therefore if a part of it contracts impurity, then all of it is considered to be impure.
I see. Okay, thank you.
Okay. Now we come along to the idea of Haravi Ba'Kodesh Pasal. When we talk about Kodesh, the 4th level becomes unfit. So let me just go over this briefly, okay? We have different levels. You have the Avi Avos Atuma, okay? And the Avi Avos Atuma, it's important to understand, before I go on, the difference between the words Tameh and Pasal. Very big difference. It's critical to bear it in mind. Tameh, when I say something is Tameh, it means that it itself is impure and has the power to pass on that impurity to something else, to make it the next level. So if something is Rishon, right? This Rishon can make a Sheni. If I say it's Tameh, it can make the next thing Tameh. Okay? If something is a Sheni and I say it's Tameh, it has the ability to make a Shlishi. When I say that a Shlishi is Pasal, what it means is that this thing cannot be used. It itself is impure, but it cannot pass it on further. It does not go further than the Shlishi. But if I say that the Shlishi is Tameh, then what I'm saying is that the shlishi can pass it on and make a revi'i. So, with regards to truma, we say shlishi is puzzle, which means if something was sheni, right? If something was sheni and it touched the truma becomes a shlishi and it's puzzle. Okay, the shlishi is truma. Something that is shlishi, right? If it's truma, it only becomes puzzle, and now if that truma touches something else, it can no longer pass on to make the next thing a revi'i. Okay? That makes sense? However, if I say that this thing is not truma, okay? This thing is with regards to something that is considered to be kodesh, that is going to be brought in the Beis Hamikdash, like a korban, right? So then, if it's considered to be tamei on a shlishi level, then it can pass on to a revi'i level. Okay? So now, past revi'i, we say with regards to kodesh, that's it. Revi'i is where it ends. It's puzzle. It does not pass on to chamishli. Okay, so that's the extra stringency of kodesh over truma. Truma only goes to shlishi, but truma only goes to shlishi. Revi'i goes to revi'i. Okay, so now the question says, like, we're bringing a brayso for a source for this rule. Tanya was told in the brayso, Rabbi Yasi. Rabbi Yasi says, from where do we learn that a revi'i in the case of kodesh, that it is unfit, that it is puzzle? And for the Gemara, v'dinhu, it's a kal v'chomer. It's a kal v'chomer. What is a kal v'chomer? A kal v'chomer, I'm sure everybody knows what it is, but just in order to be able to follow this through, I just want to explain what a kal v'chomer is. Kal v'chomer means if I have a particular instance where something is a more severe case, okay, and I have something which is a more lenient case, and the law is such in the lenient case, then I say we definitely apply this law, right, this stringency in law with regards to the case that is more severe, okay? That's the kal v'chomer. Kal v'chomer, that if this is the case in a more lenient instance, then certainly this law would apply in a more stringent case, okay? So now, what is the kal v'chomer that teaches me that even a revi'i can become puzzle? So he says like this. Follow this. Oma mechusa kippurim shemuta b'truma. Puzzle b'kodesh. In a case of a mechusa kippurim is someone who, let's say, a zav or a zava or a mitzayra, and they are people who have become tamei. Now, they're tamei for 7 days. At the end of the 7 days, they have to go to the mikvah. And after the mikvah, they need to have har of shemesh, which means that the sun has to set. Once the sun sets, they have an extra level of kedusha, of a purification. That purification is enough to allow them to eat truma. However, it's not enough of a purification to allow them to eat from the karbanos. What will allow them to once again eat from the karbanos? Once they bring up their karban, that's when they're once again allowed to partake in their karban. So now we say like this. If a mechusa kippurim, who is allowed to eat truma, right? But nevertheless, he's not yet allowed to eat kodesh, right? So shlishi, sheposel b'truma, then a shlishi, which is unfit in the case of truma, enidin sheyaser revi la kodesh. Is it not logical that it should create a revi in the case of kodesh? So this is where I need you to really fasten your seatbelts and to understand what's going on. Okay. Join me, if you can, in Rashi, the Rashi which says shlishi sheposel b'truma. Okay, we say that a shlishi with regards to truma is possible. But how do we know that a shlishi with regards to truma is invalid? Where do we learn this from? So we learn this also from a kal v'chomer. Okay? And Rashi is going to tell us what the kal v'chomer is. This is something that's taught in the Maseches Sotah. Okay? He says, "Kedenafkalon kal v'chomer b'Maseches Sotah." We learn out that a shlishi is possible by truma from a kal v'chomer. But what's the logic? The logic is like this: Oma tful yoim. If a tful yoim shemuta b'maisa also b'truma. What is a tful yoim? We explain. A tful yoim is somebody who has gone to the mikvah but has not yet had the sun set. What is the law of this person? This person can eat Maisa Sheni, okay? He can eat Maisa Sheni, but he cannot eat Truma yet. He has to wait till the night in order to eat Truma. Now, let's understand the status of this person, okay? This person, we're going to say, is a Sheni Latuma, which means that a sheretz, let's just take the example of the scenario so we can follow this along. Let's take the example. You have an earthenware vessel. The earthenware vessel has a sheretz go into its airspace. What happens to that vessel? What happens to that earthenware vessel? That earthenware vessel is now number one, Rishon Latuma. What happens to the contents inside of that? What happens to the contents of that's inside of that vessel? They are what's called a sheni. Okay, they are a sheni. Now, that sheni, right? That food, whatever's inside that food, has now come into contact with a person. Okay, that person is now. What do we call that person? Anybody? I'll give you a cookie. What's that person? If the vessel is a rishon and the food is a sheni, the food that comes into contact with the person makes the person a what? Makes him a shlishi.
The food makes him nothing. Oh, shlishi.
The food
A
makes
person can become a shlishi?
With regards to truma. With regards to truma. Not with regards to anything else. With regards to truma, he becomes a shlishi. Okay? So now this guy is a shlishi. We say, right? We say with regards to him, yes, that he can partake in the Meiser Sheni, but he cannot partake in the Truma. He has to wait for the Har of Shemesh, right? So now, a Sheni sheposel b'Meiser, if you have a Sheni that is posel that is posel for Meiser, ein din sheyaseh shlishi b'truma. Isn't it a kal v'chomer? Isn't it logical that it should make a shlishi b'truma? Which means like this. We said that the guy who's a sheni needs to go into the mikvah. He cannot eat the meiser. He cannot eat the meiser before he goes into the mikvah, right? But this Tvul Yoim guy cannot eat the truma yet because he has to wait for the night. So if that's the case, it would be logical to say that the sheni can make something else a shlishi in truma. Okay? That's what the Gemara is saying. It's not so easy to understand it because there's a certain principle that makes it difficult to understand. And that is like this. When I make a kal v'chomer, usually what I say about a kal v'chomer is that if the law is such, in this case, the same law should be applied in another case. Here, what we're saying is not the same law should apply, but we bump it up. We make it pass on an extra level of tumah to extend to the third. And that's why it's hard to understand this kal v'chomer, because it's not the regular kal v'chomer. The regular kal v'chomer is, I say, if this would be the case in a more lenient case, then let's just apply the same stringency in a more severe case. Here we're saying, since the sheni, right, is not allowed to eat, since the sheni is not allowed to eat the ma'aser, is not even allowed to eat ma'aser sheni, right, until he goes to the mikvah, and nevertheless, that's not enough for truma. So then, therefore, let's make this sheni, the truma, be able to pass on the tuma to the shlishi when it comes to truma. And so, based on this kal v'chomer, what we want to do over here is say, apply that same kal v'chomer, that same logic with regards to going from shlishi to revi. That what? That if we say that a shlishi, that if we say that by a mechusar kippurim, that the mechusar kippurim is able to eat truma, but he cannot eat kodesh, so then let us therefore say that a shlishi l'tumah can pass on to a revi'i l'tumah with regards to kodesh, and thereby make it possible. That's what we're trying to say. Okay. But 1 second. How do you know that a shlishi is asur? In other words, a shlishi is already tamei by kodesh. The Gemara says, "V'lamagnu shlishi lekodesh min haTorah." That's something we already know from an explicit verse in the Torah that teaches us that by kodesh a shlishi is still tamei. In other words, when it comes to the kal v'chomer, and you want to tell me that you should learn out from the kal v'chomer the same law that you're learning from, I will respond to you and say that law I already know from an explicit verse in the Torah, and therefore I would never need a kal v'chomer for that. 1 second, I was trying to get in. What are we saying? I'm sorry, I'm trying to find the right words to explain this. If I'm going to come along and say that we don't know that a shlishi with regards to kodesh, that it becomes tamei, right? Then I could come along and say, let's use the kal v'chomer to teach me that just like truma is possible when it comes to shlishi, so to kodesh, which is more stringent, it's logical to say that it should be a shlishi l'tumah. But what's the problem? The problem is I already know from a pasuk that shlishi is going to be pasul or tamei by kodesh. Therefore, when I'm using a kal v'chomer, I'm going to come along and use that kal v'chomer not to teach me about a shlishi, which I already know, but to teach me about a revi that I don't yet know. So therefore, the revi b'kal v'chomer, and therefore the revi, which is that it should be unfit in the case of kodesh, that I'm going to learn out from a kal v'chomer. So the Gemara is going to explain this. Says the Gemara, shlishi lekodesh min haTorah minayim. You just told me that what? That a shlishi, right, for kodesh is something that is taught explicitly in the Torah. Where do I know this from? How do I know that a shlishi, when it comes to kodesh, is going to be tamei? So he says, the Chsiv, it says in the Pasuk, the meat that touches anything tamei shall not be eaten. Now, we're talking about any meat that touches anything tamei shall not be eaten. Says the Gemara, since this refers to the meat that touches anything that's tamei. So obviously we're talking about even something that is a sheni. In other words, when I say that it touches anything that's tummy, it means that the meat touched a sheni, and nevertheless the pasuk says that it should not be eaten. What's it talking about? This is talking about in Parshas Tzav. It's talking about the korban shlamim, right? It's talking about shlamim, and with regards to the shlamim, the Torah says that if this meat of the korban shlamim touches anything tamei, right? If we're saying anything tamei, we say nonetheless, you shall not eat it. So that tells me that what? That this thing that it is touching is at the very least, it's going to be a sheni, right? And if it's going to be a sheni, that means the meat itself becomes a shlishi. And if it becomes a shlishi, and we say you cannot eat it, so here's the source, the biblical source, to tell me that by kodesh, shlamim is kodesh, that it cannot be eaten because it came into contact with the sheni. So the pasuk already tells me that the shlishi is tamei by kodesh. So therefore, revi mikal v'chaymer. So when Rabbi Yossi says that a revi is not fit in the case of kodesh, it's through a kal v'chaymer. So Hod Amoron, he refers to the kal v'chaymer that we stated at the beginning of the brisa. Okay, everybody with me? Or did I lose everybody? See, I spent quite a bit of time trying to wrap my head around this. So if it's not coming across clear, the problem is not with the Gemara. The problem is with me.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
is there ever a case where something can be tamei but not possible?
No. It cannot be tummy and not puzzle. It's only the other way around. You have something that is puzzle but not tummy, meaning to say that it has no power to pass on the tumah. Tummy means that it itself is impure and it passes.
That's what I meant. The reverse. I'm sorry.
Right, in the verse, yes. Truma, if truma becomes tummy, right? If it becomes puzzle as a shlishi, it does not pass it on to anything else as a revi, right? Unless that piece of food is something that is going to be used for kodesh, in which case, with regard to the laws of kodesh, it does contract the tumah from the shlishi. In other words, let me try to explain this again. You have chulin, you have ma'aser sheni, you have truma, and you have kodesh, and then you have chatas. You have all these different groups of food. So when I say that the chulin only goes to the sheni and not the shlishi, what I mean is that if the food that you're looking at is only going to be used for chulin purposes, then the tumah doesn't go past sheni. However, if that chulin, let's say, is a sheni, but it touches something that's going to be used for truma, then I say there is shlishi, even though it's the food that was touching this chulin. Chulin is touching something that's going to be used for truma, but this truma now becomes a shlishi. It's not that chulin cannot pass on. It means that food that is only going to be used for chulin, right? We don't go past sheni. Food that's only going to be used for truma, we say there's no such thing as a truma food contracting tumah from something that is a shlishi, right? So therefore, let's say I have let's take a piece of meat, okay? I've got a piece of meat that would make sense. I've got some flour, right? Let's take I've got flour, right? This flour came into contact with a piece of meat that is shlishi, right? That is shlishi. So I say with regards to the flour, that flour is still absolutely fine for the kohen to eat in a state of tahara, the flour has not become tamei in any shape or form. Okay, that's what it means that it doesn't go past shlishi. However, if this flour is being offered up on the mizbeach as a korban, right? This flour is not ritually pure in order to be able to consume it. You can't. It now becomes puzzle. Even though for truma it would have been fine, for kodesh it's not fine. Does that make sense?
Yes. Yes, it does.
Okay. Let's move on to the 9th case. Okay. Says the Gemara. Uvid truma. So now the Mishnah has mentioned that a very unique case with regards to kodesh versus truma is that in the case of truma, if one of the person's hands become tamei, the other hand is still tahor. But in the case of kodesh, you've got to immerse both hands, even if only one hand became tamei. And obviously, we're talking about on a derabanan, because by the Raisa, there's no such thing as just your hands becoming tamei. Once you become tamei, your whole body is tamei. You've got to go to the mikvah, right? We're talking about a rabbinic tumah, right? Person came into contact with rabbinic tumah, and therefore the rabbis made the hands of the person a sheni, right? So we say if one of your hands became tamei with regards to truma, you don't have to wash the other hand. It's only the one hand you have to wash. Whereas when it comes to kodesh, both hands need to be immersed in the mikvah. So now Amar Reb Shizvi says, I want to qualify what the Mishnah means when it says that it becomes tamei. It's only in a particular case. B'chiburin shanu. The Mishnah taught this only with regards when the hands were joined. What does that mean that we're joined? It means that in a case, again, we're talking about kodesh over here. So in a case where the tahar hand is touching the kodesh, and then my hand touched my other hand, my tamei hand touches my tahar hand, right? Then I say that this kodesh is now not going to be possible to consume because I've made my second hand tamei. What does that mean? That means like this. Generally speaking, I would say that when my hand becomes tamei, right? I'm not going to say that I pass it on from one hand to the other, making my second hand a shlishi l'tumah, and then this hand can now make the truma tamei, right? Or puzzle even. Why? Because you don't go past 3, right? Yes? However, with regards to kodesh, they said that if you're holding on to the kodesh and you're holding it with your clean hand, but your dirty hand, which means your impure hand, touches your clean hand and your clean hand is touching the meat, then I say that that you have to immerse both hands, because that would make the kodesh invalid. Understand what it's saying? Yeah. That's what Reb Shizvi wants to say. Now, not everybody agrees with Reb Shizvi, but that's what Reb Shizvi wants to say. That when we came along and we said that it's going to be a problem if one of your hands become tamei, it's only in a case where that one hand would be joining your second hand while your second hand is coming into contact with kodesh. But otherwise, you wouldn't need to immerse both hands into the mikvah. That's Reb Shizvi's opinion. You still with me?
Yeah.
Okay. Says the Gemara, 1 second. Abaya comes along and he challenges Reb Shizvi from the following brisa. Okay. Let me just explain. Bichlal, we say, in order for something to contract impurity, it has to be wet, right? If it's dry, it generally speaking will not contract and it's not susceptible to tumah. Okay, so what's the story in the following brisa? Yad neguva, a dry hand, metamo chaverta, makes its counterpart tamei, letame lekodesh, to make kodesh that it touches tamei, avaloi letruma, but not in the case of truma. This sounds very similar to our case in our Mishnah. In fact, it's almost exactly the same. Okay, Divrei Rebbe, these are the words of Rebbe. Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yossi ben Yehuda says, Lifso, the dry hand that is tamei, will make the other hand tamei to make this kodesh that it touches unfit of a loyla tame, but not to make it tame. As I explained before, the difference between something becoming puzzle and something becoming tame. Tame means that it can pass it on, right? Puzzle means that it in itself is invalid, doesn't take it any further. Okay, so we have a machlekes between Rebbe and Rabbi Yossi. Rebbe says that with truma it doesn't become tame, but with kodesh it does become tame if one hand that is dry which is tame, touches the other hand, right? It becomes tame, right, for kodesh, but not for truma. And Rabbi Yossi says that it doesn't make it tame, but it makes it possible, okay, but not tame. Fine. Now comes along Abaya and he says, follow the logic. If you, Reb Shizvi, were right, then there's no chiddush over here. If you're going to say that the stringency that we're saying, that one hand contaminating the other applies, even when they are not joined, when the second hand is touching the kodesh, that's the novelty of Rebbe saying this stringency applies even when the first hand is dry, right? Because if it was, one second, let's just finish for a second. If you're going to say that what? That when the hands are joined, the stringency does apply. When they're not joined, then it does not apply. So then what's the special novelty? What's the chiddush of Rebbe by saying that the decree applies even when the first hand is dry? In other words, if our concern is that the first hand itself might have touched the kodesh, right? Then the concern is the same whether the first hand is wet or dry. Why? Because even a dry hand that is tamei, which is that therefore a sheni, clearly it has the ability to make tamei any kodesh that it touches. Okay, give me about 30 seconds to explain to you another important halacha to make sense of this, okay? The Chachamim made a decree that if my hand, which is a sheni, touches water, this water now becomes a rishon, okay? This water becomes a rishon, okay? So, according to Reb Shizvi, what you're telling me is that what we're concerned about is that if your hands are touching each other, then maybe your first hand is going to come and touch the kodesh, because by touching your first hand, you might be actually what? You might actually be going to touch the kodesh itself. So therefore, we were worried about that. And therefore, we said you have to go put both hands in the mikvah, right? Then if that's the case, so then what's the chiddush of Rebbe in this Mishnah, where Rebbe says that if the hands, that when we have a case of somebody's dry hands, right, that we say that it can make its counterpart tamei to be metame kodesh if if the concern here is you know what? I'm not gonna be able to explain this in the time left because we're already over time. So please, if you don't mind, let us come back together tomorrow and we'll go through this again tomorrow. Because it's gonna take me at least 5 to 7 minutes to explain this. So let's do it again in Mitzvah tomorrow. And tomorrow. Again.
In Yisra Hashem. Thank you, Rebbe.
Thank you for your patience, Kevra.
Yashikar. Thank you, Rabbi.
Right.
Thank you.